One of the more stimulating or controversial ideas I talk about is the biophysics of reincarnation. I've had the privilege of being an osteopathic physician for 38 years. And part of that means that I've gotten to treat newborns who've just been born and they have birth injuries. And if you do work with babies and tie into birth injuries, and you know how to do perceptual transference, what you find is you can tie into the trauma in this body that was in their last lifetime. Now, I know this sounds crazy, and there's a whole lecture on biophysics of reincarnation that if you want to know more about this, I would urge you to either watch my lecture or come listen to me talk. But I'll just tease you with this much. The first law of thermodynamics is that the total energy of a system is a sum of the potential and kinetic energy. Now, the human body is a hologram that's full of all these shimmering energetics that fluctuate back and forth with potential versus kinetic energy. Are they doing, or are they just, in the moment? So there are real manifestations of potential and kinetic energy in the body. And most of the time, dysfunctions and patterns of trauma and so on is kinetic energy that is stuck in the gel, so to speak. Now, if at the moment of death, someone is tied up in the kinetic, like a mother who's worried about their children in an earthquake or something like that, those portions of her hologram, if she dies at that instance, have diminished potential energy. So what happens when they pop through in their next lifetime is that those areas of diminished potential energy showed up as distorted growth. They'll have birthmarks or scars or birth patterns that are derivatives of that moment when they died in their last incarnation, and the hologram of that is now manifesting in their new body now that they've entered their new body. Now, this information doesn't happen with every child, and it doesn't happen like every time you touch a baby with a birth injury. But I believe that it is reproducible, that if you are taught how to do perceptual transference and you know how to do it correctly, that you can derive the same information from a child if you know how to properly interpret it. And I have only a few anecdotes where other practitioners have worked with children. And the one that comes to mind is a little baby I saw. And every time this was when I was still in Phoenix, and every time I treated this child and I locked onto her little head, I would get the image of a mother who was trapped under rubble in an earthquake, and that she was laying there and her children were out there somewhere, and she was crying for them and crying for them. And this little baby, the way that the baby postured was she would lay there and cry and go, ah, ah, and she was nonverbal. She couldn't talk at all. But what her body kept doing over and over and over was calling out. Well, there were other health problems in the family, and one of her siblings ended up having to go to UCLA for some health problems, and so the family started going to Los Angeles for care, and I sent the baby to one of my friends who practices in Malibu. And I was at a medical meeting, and he comes walking up to me, and we're talking about this little baby. And he says, "Tell me, Carlisle, what is this dark cave I go to when I treat this baby? Because, every time I touch her, I see this cave." And I told him about the earthquake and the mother pinned under the rubble, and he goes, "That fits." Now let's be clear. You've got two 50-something-year-old doctors in a lobby in a hotel at a medical meeting, and we're talking about images that we get from holding the head of a nonverbal child with cerebral palsy that can't sit up. Now, you can argue that we're both delusional, but I say that that's inter-rater reliability showing up in a more complex form. Like when you're studying manipulation, you want to make sure that when I palpate this muscle and I say there's something wrong, that other people will say the same thing. Well, that's true in cranial techniques as well. And when you're an instructor and you're trying to decide whether someone got the material and can use it in their work, inter-rater reliability is how you study that. But I believe that these techniques about treating newborns and being aware that birth injuries happen and that this might be the model to explain what they're seeing in the baby, that if nothing else, it's a useful model to help them understand ways to help the child. Because when you use the techniques I'm talking about with babies and you take into account this past life information, you get much more dramatic and lasting